evening. It's Pastor Trish, and it's Thursday, August 20th, and we are going to spend a few minutes with Psalm 58. And I'm going to warn you, Psalm 58 isn't a pleasant psalm, as you will soon see. It's a psalm that does not mince words. It's a cry for help, a psalm of lament. And I think what we're going to do is just kind of walk through the psalm. So the first couple verses, this is what we hear. Do you indeed decree what is right, you gods? Do you judge people fairly? No. In your hearts you devise wrongs, and your hands deal out violence on earth. Now, my translation here says gods with a small g. Other translations often will say mighty ones. And so the question becomes, is the psalmist talking about other gods that others might be worshiping, or mighty ones? It might be other humans as well. But it's clear that it is someone who is in charge, a ruling of some kind, and they are certainly um, dealing with injustice rather than justice. And so, in your hearts, you devise wrong. Your hands deal out violence on earth. The person who's crying out for help is certainly not being treated fairly. And then there's some descriptions of who these mighty ones, what these mighty ones are like in the next few verses. The psalmist says, the wicked go astray from the womb. They err from their birth, speaking lies. They have venom like the venom of a serpent, like the deaf adder that stops its heat so that it does not hear the voice of charmers or of the cunning enchanters. And then in the next few verses, we are hit with um, hatred, bitterness, despair, certainly anger, as we hear the psalmist cry out to God, asking God to basically wreak havoc on these mighty ones who are so evil or so um, uh, unjust. And so the psalmist goes on and says, "O God, break the teeth in their mouths, tear out the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. Let them vanish like water that runs away, like grass, let them be trodden down and wither. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into slime, like the untimely birth that never sees the sun. Sooner than your pots can feel the heat of thorns, whether green or ablaze, may he sweep them away." That last verse, they have a hard time, biblical scholars, it's just it's corrupted is the way they talk about it, language in the Hebrew. It's just too difficult to understand what the actual translation is supposed to be. But you can hear the psalmist asking God to not treat them kindly, right? Sometimes when we hear this kind of language as we are reading the Psalms, it would be natural for us to struggle with that. And there's a couple of things I would point out. One is that the psalmist isn't saying, I am going to do this. The psalmist isn't asking God to let he or she be vengeful themselves, but they're asking God to treat those persons in what they would say is a just manner, as judgment for their own unjust actions. And so they're asking God to do these things in some ways, perhaps on their behalf, or to give the world, to restore justice to the world. And the other thing I would invite you to think about is, and perhaps you have had um, difficult, difficult experiences in your own life. But otherwise, I would invite you to consider what I had a seminary professor who always talked about those in our world, those among us who are the lost, the least, the littlest, the loneliest, and the last. It was the five L's, those who are lost, least, lonely, littlest, or last in our world. And often they are at the mercy of very unjust systems. We are talking a lot in our congregation. We just had a conversation again last evening. But in our society today, I think some of the conversations we're having about racism and unjust systems that you and I didn't put in place, but you and I have been, for example, beneficiaries of them. If you are white like me, and our friends and neighbors who just simply by virtue of their color of their skin have been denied mortgages for their home, for example, or were denied ability to move into a neighborhood of their choosing, and all of those examples. We just finished up a Bible study this evening, and we were talking about even as people driving our cars and how we are sometimes treated based on the color of our skin or because we look middle class. I'm not driving an old clunker that needs repair, and I might be treated differently. And we do that to one another. And so think about for a moment those among us who are dealing with injustices, not of their own doing, who are oppressed every single day. Other examples, of course, might be refugees, people who have been victims of sexual assault or sexual harassment, people who are dealing with domestic abuse issues. Unfortunately, the list can go on and on. People with disabilities. So, all sorts of ways in which people may be in such despair and have had to deal with such violence that they indeed are going to cry out to God for God to act in these ways. And it might be easiest for us to understand that when we think about those who are so powerless. And then finally, the last two verses of the psalm, again, it takes a sudden turn again. It's kind of like we get whiplash reading and praying this psalm this evening. And again, by the way, with those verses, they may not be a prayer that we would pray for ourselves, but perhaps it is a prayer that we would pray to God on behalf of those who are truly powerless. And so I invite you to think about it that way as well. But the psalmist then ends the psalm with praise to God, praise and uh, praise for God vindicating people for their suffering. And so we end with these words: The righteous will rejoice when they see vengeance done. They will bathe their feet in the blood of the wicked. People will say, Surely there is a reward for the righteous. Surely there is a God who judges on earth. Still not words of comfort, still words of vengeance, of asking for that not just relief from suffering, but that those who cause the suffering will pay. This psalm reminds us that the pain in many people's lives can be very, very real. And it would not be unusual or even, um, it's not difficult to understand why they might wish for the destruction of the oppressors when they are facing massive injustice. And I think it means that even the most loving and patient person might wish for that if they were suffering in those ways. And so I think the prayer I wish to end us with tonight is simply this: help us, God, to see the world through those eyes of people who suffer such oppression. Help us to see through their eyes, and help us, God, to work to reform and to overcome these places where injustice is so real. Amen. Okay, like I said, it's kind of a tough psalm for tonight to deal with, and that's okay as well. So I will see you tomorrow night for one more song for this week. Have a good evening.